Nathaniel Carter had booked the remote Airbnb for one reason: peace. No ringing phones, no urgent emails, no board meetings dictating his every move. Just the quiet hum of the wind through the pine trees and the distant rush of a river. He needed this. After years of building his company from the ground up, amassing millions before 30, he was burned out. His success had bought him luxury, but never the peace that he craved. So he had chosen this secluded mountain cabin, far from the chaos of city life. But he never expected love to come knocking. The first night was exactly what he had hoped for: silence. He sat by the fire, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, staring at the flames. The air smelled of pine and rain, and for the first time in months he felt his shoulders relax. Then, just as he was about to turn in for the night, there was a frantic knock at the door. Nathaniel frowned. No one was supposed to be here. He had booked the entire property for himself. Warily, he set his glass down and opened the door. A woman stood there, drenched from head to toe, shivering from the cold mountain rain. Her long brown hair clung to her face, and her green eyes, wide with desperation, locked onto his. I'm sorry," she stammered. "My car broke down a few miles back, no service." "I didn't know where else to go," Nathaniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was supposed to be his escape, not a rescue mission, but he wasn't cruel. "Come inside," he said, stepping aside. She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should trust him. But the wind howled behind her, and she finally stepped through the doorway, dripping onto the wooden floor. "Sit by the fire," Nathaniel instructed, already moving to grab a towel. She hesitated before obeying, kneeling in front of the flames with a sigh of relief. He handed her the towel, and she wrapped it around herself. "Thank you," she murmured. Nathaniel crossed his arms, studying her. "Who are you?" "Mara," she answered. "I was supposed to be staying at a cabin a few miles down the road, but my GPS must have led me the wrong way. Then my car just died. I was going to try and find help in the morning, but I didn't expect the storm to get this bad." Nathaniel exhaled. "You're lucky you found this place. There's nothing but wilderness for miles." Mara gave a small, breathless laugh. "Yeah." "Lucky?" She was still shaking, and Nathaniel couldn't ignore the way her fingers trembled as she held the towel closer. "I'll get you some dry clothes," he said. Without waiting for her response, he walked to his suitcase and pulled out a sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants. They would be huge on her, but it was better than staying in soaked clothes. When he returned, she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to put them on," he said firmly. "You'll get sick otherwise." Mara hesitated before taking them. "Thank you." Nathaniel nodded and turned away to give her privacy. He poured her a cup of tea, waiting until he heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him. When he turned back, she was curled up on the couch, his oversized sweatshirt swallowing her frame. Something about the sight made something tighten in his chest. He shook the thought away. "I'll drive you to your cabin in the morning," he said, setting the tea in front of her. Mara sighed in relief. "I appreciate it, really." Nathaniel sat in the armchair across from her. He wasn't sure why he was still watching her, why he hadn't retreated to his room like he originally planned. Maybe it was because, despite the exhaustion in her eyes, she still had a quiet strength about her. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a warm glow between them. Nathaniel didn't know it yet, but peace wouldn't be the only thing he found in this cabin. Nathaniel woke to the scent of freshly brewed coffee. It was disorienting. He wasn't used to anyone else being in his space. For a moment, he forgot about the unexpected visitor from the storm. But then he heard the quiet shuffle of movement in the kitchen, and it all came rushing back. Mara. She was standing by the stove, her damp hair now dry and falling in soft waves over her shoulders. His sweatshirt still hung loosely on her frame. and she was peering into a pan as if debating whether she was about to ruin whatever she was trying to cook. The sight was so domestic, so unexpected, that Nathaniel found himself hesitating in the doorway, watching. She caught him before he could step back. "You're awake." He crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "You didn't have to cook." "I know," she said, glancing at him briefly before returning her attention to the pan. "But you let me stay." Seemed like the least I could do. Nathaniel wasn't the type to let people linger in his space, but Mara had an air of quiet determination that told him she wasn't the kind of person who liked being indebted to anyone. He respected that. "What are you making?" She lifted a spatula, showing him what looked like an attempt at scrambled eggs. "Something edible, I hope." There was something refreshing about her honesty. No pretense, no calculated charm, just a woman trying to make the best of an awkward situation. Nathaniel stepped forward, taking the spatula from her hand before she could protest. "You're burning them." She huffed but stepped aside as he took over. "I never claimed to be a chef." He worked in silence for a moment, the kitchen filling with the scent of butter and eggs as he expertly salvaged the meal. When he finally slid the food onto 2 plates, Mara looked at him with open curiosity. "You do this often?" "Cook," he set the plates on the small dining table, "only when I have to." "I prefer restaurants." "Of course you do." She sat down across from him, picking up her fork. "You have the air of someone who doesn't settle for anything less than 5 stars. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" She shrugged. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to control, things being done a certain way. The way you took over just now, that wasn't about the eggs." "That's just who you are." Most people wouldn't have dared to analyze him so openly. It was unsettling. "You're observant," he said instead of addressing her words. "I have to be." There was something in her tone that hinted at a story, but she didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. They ate in silence, the sounds of the forest outside filtering through the open kitchen window. It was peaceful, yet Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that Mara's presence changed something in the air. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Thank you for the food." "And for letting me stay." Nathaniel nodded, standing to clear the plates. "I'll drive you to your cabin after I check the road conditions." Mara hesitated, then exhaled. "Actually, I don't have a cabin." Nathaniel stilled, the plate halfway to the sink. Slowly, he turned to face her. "What?" She met his gaze, not looking the least bit guilty. "I wasn't lost." "Not exactly." His fingers tightened around the plate. "Explain." Mara sighed, tucking her hair behind her ear. "My car did break down, that part was true, but I didn't have a cabin waiting for me." "I was just driving." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "With no destination." "More like no plan," she exhaled. "I wasn't running from anything, if that's what you're thinking. I just needed to get away. And then the storm hit and I saw your cabin and I thought, maybe I could just figure things out in the morning." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He didn't like being deceived, even if her reason wasn't malicious. Trust was something he didn't give easily, and she'd already bent the truth once. He crossed his arms. "So, what now?" "You expect me to let you stay?" "No," she said immediately. "I'll call a tow truck as soon as I can get service. I don't want to impose." There was something in her expression, something guarded. Nathaniel had met enough people in his life to know when someone was hiding more than they were saying, but he also knew when to back off. He studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. "You can stay until you sort things out." Her eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to do that." "I know." For the first time since she arrived, she looked genuinely caught off guard. "Thank you." Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply turned, washed the dishes, and tried to ignore the fact that for some reason he wasn't entirely sure he wanted her to leave. Nathaniel wasn't sure why he had offered to let Mara stay longer. He wasn't the type to invite strangers into his space, let alone someone who had already bent the truth. but something about her made it impossible to turn her away. By late afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving behind crisp mountain air and a sky painted in hues of gold and violet. Mara stood by the cabin's porch, gazing out at the wet forest as if trying to convince herself she belonged there. Nathaniel stepped beside her, hands tucked into his pockets. "The roads are still a mess. It'll take a while before the tow truck can get here." Mara nodded without looking at him. "I figured." Silence stretched between them, but for once, it wasn't uncomfortable. Nathaniel found himself studying her profile, the way her lips pressed together in thought, the distant look in her eyes. She wasn't just here because of a broken car. She was running from something, even if she wouldn't admit it. He could have asked, pushed for the truth, but he knew what it was like to want to escape without explaining why. Instead, he said, "Come on." Mara glanced at him. "Where?" "You're stuck here for now, might as well see the place properly." She hesitated, then nodded. They walked in silence, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the distant rush of the river. Nathaniel had chosen this place because it was the closest thing to freedom he had felt in years. He wondered what Mara saw when she looked at it. She stopped near a fallen tree, brushing her fingers against its damp bark. "You come here often?" "No," Nathaniel admitted. "First time." She raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "You act like you own the place." He huffed a quiet laugh. "I don't." "But you could." Nathaniel turned to her. "What makes you say that?" Mara gave him a knowing look. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to getting what he wants, or at least someone who doesn't have to ask permission." She wasn't wrong. Nathaniel had spent years building his company, making decisions that shaped his future without waiting for anyone's approval. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, none of that mattered. "I wanted peace," he said finally. Mara inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a moment. "I get that." They continued walking until they reached a clearing where the river cut through the landscape, its waters still swollen from the storm. The late afternoon light reflected off the surface, turning it into a shimmering ribbon of gold. Mara crouched near the edge, dipping her fingers into the water. "It's freezing." Nathaniel sat on a nearby rock, watching her. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys sitting still." She glanced at him. "What makes you say that?" "You're restless." Mara exhaled, her gaze drifting back to the water. "I didn't plan to be here. I didn't plan anything, really." Nathaniel waited. She hesitated before continuing. "I spent so much time doing what I was supposed to do, checking all the right boxes. But I woke up one day and realized I didn't even recognize my own life." He understood that more than he cared to admit. Mara looked at him. "What about you?" "Why are you really here?" Nathaniel considered his answer. He had told himself it was about escaping the noise, but maybe it was more than that. Maybe he was just as lost as she was, only in a different way. "I needed space to think," he said. Mara studied him for a moment before nodding as if she understood more than his words revealed. They stayed by the river until the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. As they made their way back to the cabin, Nathaniel realized something unsettling. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a rush to be alone. Nathaniel watched Mara as they walked back to the cabin, the late evening air crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. Something had shifted between them by the river, an unspoken understanding, a quiet connection that neither of them had acknowledged but both had felt. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. He added another log, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the dry bark. Mara stood near the window, arms folded, gazing out at the darkened forest. "You don't have to stay up," she said without turning around. Nathaniel leaned against the mantel, studying her profile in the dim light. "Neither do you." A small, breathy laugh escaped her. "I guess not." He crossed the room, stopping beside her. Outside, the trees swayed with the wind, their branches whispering secrets to the night. The silence between them was thick with something unspoken, something neither of them had dared to put into words. She turned to face him, her gaze searching his. "I don't know what happens next." Nathaniel knew she wasn't talking about her broken-down car or where she'd go when the roads cleared. She was talking about them, about the pull between them that had grown stronger with every passing hour. He reached out, brushing his fingers against hers, a hesitant touch testing the waters. She didn't pull away. "Neither do I," he admitted. Mara inhaled sharply, as if surprised by his honesty. She had seen through him from the beginning, had peeled back the carefully constructed layers he had built over the years. And yet, she hadn't run. He lifted his hand to her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin. Her breath hitched, her eyes searching his for something, permission, maybe, or reassurance. He gave her both. When he kissed her, it wasn't hesitant or unsure. It was deliberate, the kind of kiss that erased doubt and set fire to everything in its path. She melted into him, her hands fisting the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer as if afraid he would disappear. But he wasn't going anywhere. The fire crackled behind them, the warmth pressing against their backs, but Nathaniel barely noticed. All he could focus on was the woman in his arms, the way she tasted like something he hadn't realized he was starving for. When they finally pulled apart, Mara rested her forehead against his, her breathing uneven. "That was." "Yeah," he murmured, his fingers still tangled in her hair. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Nathaniel traced a path down her arm, memorizing the way her skin felt beneath his fingertips. Maybe it was. She pulled back slightly, her expression unreadable. "You think things happen for a reason." He had spent most of his life believing that everything was within his control. That success, power, even happiness were things he could shape with his own hands. But Mara had walked into his life unplanned, uninvited. And yet, he couldn't imagine the last 24 hours without her. "Maybe some things do," he said finally. Mara searched his face as if trying to decipher something unspoken. Then, slowly, she nodded. The rest of the night passed in quiet conversation, stolen touches and lingering glances. They didn't talk about the future, didn't try to define what this was. But when Nathaniel woke the next morning to find her curled against him, her breathing soft and steady, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't ready to let her go. Nathaniel woke to the warmth of Mara's body against his, her slow, steady breathing the only sound in the quiet morning air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft orange glow across the room. He had never been one to linger in bed, but for once, he wasn't in a hurry to move. Mara stirred, shifting slightly before her eyes fluttered open. There was a moment of stillness as she blinked at him, as if trying to remember where she was. Then a small, sleepy smile tugged at her lips. Something in Nathaniel's chest tightened. He had spent years prioritizing control, ensuring every part of his life was meticulously planned. But nothing about Mara had been planned, and yet, here she was wrapped in his arms, making him rethink everything. She stretched, her fingers grazing his bare arm before she sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Morning," she murmured, her voice still laced with sleep. Nathaniel sat up as well, watching her carefully. "Morning." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of last night hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Mara glanced toward the window where the early morning light filtered through the trees. "Looks like the storm finally passed." Nathaniel followed her gaze. The sky was clear, the forest glistening with the remnants of rain. The roads would be clearing soon. She turned back to him, something unreadable in her expression. "I should probably check on my car." The words settled between them like a quiet warning. It was the first real acknowledgement that their time here was temporary. That whatever had happened between them existed in this isolated cabin away from the rest of the world. Nathaniel wasn't ready to let it end. "I'll help you," he said, standing. Mara hesitated but nodded. They dressed in silence, the air between them thick with something neither of them wanted to name. Nathaniel grabbed his keys, and they stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The ground was damp beneath their boots as they made their way down the winding path toward where Mara's car had broken down. It was still there, exactly as she had left it, mud-splattered, one tire partially sunken into the damp earth. Mara sighed, placing her hands on her hips. "Well, it's not on fire, so that's a good sign." Nathaniel crouched beside the car, inspecting the damage. "Battery's dead," he said after a moment. "And it looks like the starter might be shot," Mara groaned. "Of course it is." Nathaniel straightened, brushing dirt off his hands. "I can call for a tow." "Have a mechanic take a look," she exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, that's probably the best option." Nathaniel pulled out his phone, dialing a local service. The call was quick, the promise of a truck arriving within the next few hours. He hung up and turned back to Mara, who was leaning against the car, arms crossed. She looked lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Nathaniel said, reading her expression easily. Mara let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "That's the problem, isn't it? I came out here because I didn't want to make decisions, and now," she gestured between them. "This happened." Nathaniel stepped closer, his presence grounding. "And what exactly is this to you?" Mara met his eyes, searching for something in his face. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know it's not nothing." That was enough for now. They made their way back to the cabin, the weight of reality settling in. The tow truck would come, the roads would clear, and then what? Nathaniel wasn't used to uncertainty. He had built an empire on calculated risks, on knowing every possible outcome before making his move. But Mara was the first risk he had taken without a plan. And he wasn't sure he wanted to let her go. When the truck finally arrived, the mechanic confirmed what Nathaniel already suspected: the car needed more than just a jump. It would have to be towed to the nearest town for repairs, which could take days. Mara sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Guess I'm stranded a little longer." Nathaniel's lips pressed together. He should have felt relieved that she wasn't leaving yet, but the delay was temporary. She turned to him, tilting her head. "What?" he exhaled. "Stay," Mara blinked. "I don't exactly have a choice." "I don't mean just for the repairs," Nathaniel clarified. "Stay longer." "With me?" The words hung between them, heavier than the morning fog. Mara's expression softened. "Nathaniel, I don't do things like this," he admitted, stepping closer. "I don't meet someone and let them turn my life upside down in 24 hours. But you did." He took her hand, his grip firm, steady. "And I don't want this to end just because your car gets fixed." Mara stared at him, her breath catching. "You're asking me to stay?" "Yes." She hesitated, conflict flickering in her eyes. Nathaniel knew she wasn't the type to make decisions lightly. She had been running from something before she arrived here. He didn't know exactly what, but he knew it wasn't something she could just ignore. Finally, she exhaled, squeezing his hand. "I don't want this to end either," she admitted. Relief flooded Nathaniel's chest. Mara smiled, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was about to say. "Okay. I'll stay." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, sealing her answer with a kiss that tasted like promise. Maybe he had come here looking for peace. But love had knocked on his door instead. Nathaniel wasn't used to uncertainty. His world had always been built on precision, on knowing every outcome before making a move. But as he watched Mara settle into the cabin, her presence turning something once temporary into something undeniably real, He realized he didn't need certainty, he just needed her. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. Mara stood near the table, running her fingers over the worn surface, her expression unreadable. She had agreed to stay, but there was still a hesitance in her movements, as if she wasn't sure she belonged in this moment. Nathaniel crossed the room and slid a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. She glanced up, startled for a fraction of a second, before offering him a quiet smile. "You're thinking too much," he observed. Mara exhaled, wrapping her hands around the mug. "I don't think I've ever done something this impulsive before." Nathaniel sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "And how does it feel?" She considered his question, her fingers tapping absently against the ceramic. "Terrifying," she admitted. Then, after a beat, "But also freeing," Nathaniel nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. Letting someone in had never been part of his plan. But Mara had walked into his life unannounced, and now the thought of her leaving felt unthinkable. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. "I don't want you to regret this." Mara met his gaze, something steady and certain in her eyes. "I won't," she said, her voice softer than before. The moment stretched between them, unspoken words lingering in the air. Before either of them could say more, a distant rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. Mara tensed, her grip tightening around her mug. "The tow truck," she murmured. Nathaniel felt something shift inside him. This was the moment that had been looming over them, the one where reality stepped in, reminding them that the world outside this cabin still existed. Mara stood, smoothing down the loose sweater she had borrowed from him. She hesitated before heading toward the door, as if reluctant to face what waited outside. Nathaniel followed, stepping onto the porch beside her as the tow truck pulled onto the dirt path. The mechanic climbed out, tipping his hat in greeting before turning his attention to Mara's car. For the first time, Nathaniel saw the uncertainty in Mara's expression, the weight of a decision she hadn't fully processed. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he murmured. Mara turned to him, her brow furrowing. "But I do, don't I? If I send the car with them, I have to figure out where I go next." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had never been one to ask for things he couldn't control, but this was different. "Stay with me," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Mara's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly. Nathaniel took a step closer, his voice low but unwavering. "Not just for now, not just because your car needs repairs. Stay because you want to." "Because I want you to." Mara searched his face, her own emotions warring in her eyes. Then, slowly, she exhaled. "I want to," she admitted. "But I don't want to just be another passing thing in your life." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "You're not." Mara studied him, her fingers twitching at her sides before she finally whispered, "Then tell me what this is." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "This is me realizing that I don't want to go back to my life before you. This is me knowing that letting you walk away would be the biggest mistake I've ever made." Mara swallowed hard, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name. The mechanic cleared his throat, reminding them that they weren't alone. Mara turned, glancing at the man who was waiting for her decision. She inhaled deeply. Then, with quiet resolve, she turned back to Nathaniel. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Nathaniel exhaled, something inside him settling into place. Mara handed her keys to the mechanic. "Just store it at the shop for now. I'll figure out the rest later." The mechanic nodded, loading the car onto the truck. Nathaniel barely noticed. His attention was entirely on Mara, the woman who had walked into his life unplanned and was now choosing to stay. When the truck disappeared down the road, Mara turned back to him, her expression softer now. "That was reckless," she admitted. Nathaniel reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Maybe, but I'd rather be reckless with you than careful without you." Mara let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You really don't do things halfway, do you? Nathaniel pulled her closer, his hands settling at her waist. Not when it comes to you. She looked up at him, her smile hesitant but real. So what happens now? Nathaniel brushed his thumb along her cheek. Whatever we want. Mara let out a breath, then nodded, and for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel didn't feel uncertain at all.